What's up, everybody? I'm Andy. Thanks for joining us for our new series on the book of Ruth. Today we're going to go through chapter 1, but over the coming weeks we're going to go through all 4 chapters. It's going to be a great time. Now, I just want to preface before we begin that this is something that you want to do with your small group or with a partner. Make sure that as you're watching these videos that you're doing it with somebody, so that there's going to be some points along the way. I'm going to ask you to pause, ask each other some questions, talk through the material, and of course, pray with one another. Today, Ruth chapter 1. Before we begin, I'm going to ask you a question just to get you used to pausing and talking with one another. The first question I have for you is, what do you find hard to give up? Great. Now you know how this is going to work. Let's jump right into the scriptures. We're going to read the first 5 verses. Read along with me. It says, "Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left there with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of one of those was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman were bereft of her 2 children and her husband." You might be thinking, what does that have to do with me, a teenager, thousands of years later? I don't have a whole lot in common with people who've been widowed and lost their spouse. I'm a teenager. I've barely gotten in the dating game or had very few serious relationships. But we have to understand that when we look through the Bible, that these individual stories fit into the greater scheme of what God is trying to convey to us. Not only that, even though these characters' lives, they experience things quite a bit different than what we experience in our day-to-day lives, the truth is that we're still human beings. We often experience the same thoughts, emotions, questions, and there's a lot we can learn from their stories. The other thing that we want to understand is that when we go through the Bible, we need to understand that the context matters, and that when we look at the smaller story, we need to understand it in the scope of the greater story, and that this story of Ruth is like every other story in the Bible. It's pointing to the person of Jesus Christ. It's pointing to the message that God has for humanity. So what we have here in this story is there's a man, and he takes his family away from Bethlehem, where God had set up his people in Judah and Israel, and he goes off to a nation, the nation of Moab, where God doesn't have a relationship with them. They don't have anything to do with our God at this point. And when they go, they begin to seek a different life. They begin to seek a life because things aren't really what they want, and they seem to be looking for things that maybe are exciting, maybe are worthwhile. And I want us to pause for a moment and just think about that thought. I'm going to get you to ask with your group, what do you sometimes want that the world has to offer? The truth is that all of us desire things. All of us see things in the distance that we want. But not all of them are good for us. The truth is that when we look around the world at us, sometimes there are things that God doesn't want us to go after. Sometimes they distract from us. Now, when Elimelech takes his family from Moab, he chances being separated from what God is doing in Israel. And he gains some temporary things. We know that he gains a wife and gains some children, and they gain a life. But the reality is they lose them. Eventually, we have to understand that the things that we gain in this life, they are temporary and often meaningless. And not to say that things in life aren't good, but the reality is that those who have much and those who have little, as the book of Ecclesiastes teaches us, that on earth it's meaningless because all of us end up in the grave. We all suffer the same fate. Without God, all these extras, they don't mean a whole lot sometimes. Even family, even some of the best things in life, they're going to end if we don't have a relationship with Jesus. Let's begin to read verse 6 and 7. It says, "Then she arose with her daughter-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. So I want to ask you a quick question right from the beginning. She notices that God is doing something in a different space, and she begins to go. I want to ask you this question. When was a time in your life that you noticed God was doing something or seen a sign that He may be real? Hopefully you shared some great stories. As Naomi realized that God had provided food to the Israelites, she began to wonder, what if I went back? And this is what happens in the story. Verse 8. It says, And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of your husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, No, but we will surely return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that I may be your husbands? Return, my daughters, go, for I am about too old to have a husband. If I have said, I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight, and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown up? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you. For the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Then she said, Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. Now, Naomi admits right in this passage that she's going back to God because she's desperate, and going back to God might not be what the girls want. Even her going back, there's no guarantee. It was going to be a hard life. And she basically says to them, You're not going to wait for me to have more kids. There's no sense in that. Go and find husbands where you're from. Sometimes when we choose to go to God, we have to be willing to lose what we had. Coming to God is hard because sometimes we lose. They had lost everything. And going back to the land of Israel was not going to be an easy journey. They had lost so much. But in seeking God, in going to see if He had something for them, a plan for them, they had lost so much. I want us to stop and ask the question, when we look at this through the lens of faith, have you given up anything to follow God? Sacrifice is hard sometimes. Orpah admits that the cost for her is too high, but Ruth chooses to go with Naomi and back to God even if life is difficult. Being a follower of God is often difficult and requires sacrifice, but spoiler, God has a plan. God is kind, He is gracious, and He does have plans in store for them. I want to ask you another question. What percentage do you think you're able to surrender and trust God's plan is the best plan? Now, keep this in mind. Unless you don't follow Jesus, nobody's a 0 and nobody's a 100. Nobody can sacrifice everything. Nobody can do everything perfectly for God. But at the same time, as my pastor once said in a sermon recently, if you even have thoughts that you want to follow God and you have thoughts that you want to give up some of your sinful habits and some of the things that don't matter to follow God, that in a sense shows that the Holy Spirit is working in you to create those desires. Let's pause and ask that. commend you for being honest and being real about some of the things that you're sacrificing to serve Jesus and your relationship with God. Let's finish reading the story, verse 19 to 22. It says, so they both went up until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? She said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has inflicted me? So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth and the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, whom returned from the land of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. You know, right in this story we see a picture of somebody who's lost their way. Naomi means pleasant, joyful, somebody who has a great demeanor, but when people call her this, she begins to tell them, call me Mara, which means bitterness. Naomi felt that God had abandoned her, that he had put his will against her in some way, and she had felt as though she had no hope. Even though she came back to God in a desperate situation, she wasn't very optimistic. It's very easy for us sometimes to think that God has abandoned us, that where is God when my life doesn't seem right? Can we stop and talk about that question for a moment? What do we do when we feel like God has abandoned us or is not on our side? Hopefully you came up with some great answers. The truth is the Bible is filled with things that teach us what to do when we feel like God is not around. And as you see, as we go through the book of Ruth, you're going to see that God has not abandoned them. You're going to see that God is moving in their story even when they don't see it, even when they don't know that he is placing things together, that God has not abandoned them, God is on their side, and God wants to see them come to the life that he has for them. Let's read verse 22 again. It says, so Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, most of us are not farmers. Most of us have probably never spent a day in our life working on the farm and don't understand harvest, don't understand all these things. But talking about the harvest here in this verse, I don't think it's just a calendar nod, but it's a hint that God is going to grow for them an opportunity. That as the harvest comes, it's a pointing to what is coming in their story, and that is to show that God is working out things that will come. Today, I'm going to leave you with one last question. But before you do that, I wanted to make sure that you understand that when you're done that I want you in your group to talk about whatever comes up, whatever things this chapter brings up in thoughts, talk about it. And then I want you to take some time to pray with and for one another and anything else that would come up. Don't forget to join us next week for chapter 2 as we're going to see where God shows up in Ruth's story. I'll leave you with this question. What are you hopeful that God has or will do in your future?